Hello, I am Anne Snellgrove McKerracher.
And I'm David McKerracher. You're listening to What's Right.
And today we are very excited to be joined by Peter Rollins, an Irish philosopher and writer who is known for challenging some maybe mainstream ideas about faith, religion, and God. And Dave and I have kind of been on our religion, God exploration, both here at Theory Underground and in our personal lives. So, no better guest to have on. Thanks for joining us, Peter.
Oh, it's great to be here. We go back a long way. I remember that conference that was run in Boise. Was it Boise?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Many years ago.
Oh my goodness.
I've been following what you've been doing ever since. I love what you guys do. Theory Underground, what's going on there. Really respect anybody really who's doing this kind of outsider thinking stuff outside the academy, outside the institutions. So yeah, I've always been a fan and a cheerleader
Oh,
from
thank
the
you.
side. Yep.
Well, it's cool because you met Anne also back then, and you met her back before we were an item. So you
Oh
know,
Yeah.
wow.
we
Yeah.
got married almost 2 years ago, and now
Mhm.
but we weren't even a thing at the time. We were just meeting. We were just kind of I think it was the fact that we were working together when we first really started vibing, like we were a good team.
Yeah,
Yeah. That's very important. It's like, it's the romantic ideal isn't, two people kind of facing each other, but really two people facing the world,
Mhm.
and kind of working together with a project, I think is a great way to develop a very strong relationship. So that's very
For
cool.
sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and so in the last few months, really, we've been bringing back up the theology, religion, and God questions, and especially on this podcast. Now, last year, we did a reading of uh, Hagelin's, is that how you say his name? His book, This Life. And it was like an exegetical reading of it, where we were just reading it aloud and talking about it during a live stream, and we brought on a lot of people throughout the process. I like it because it's a good way of challenging theism. Turning the tables on theism. Theism often will say, well, without an afterlife, without God, anything's permitted, and nothing really matters. And it's a way of turning the tables and saying, well, humans have finitude, and that's the one thing we know for certain, is that there is death, and that this life does matter, and that our time is valuable. And a lot of the religious in our lives don't tend to take that so seriously, and in fact, it seems like eternity, it has a sort of pacification effect on people that de-radicalizes them in a certain way. And so, it's a really strong challenge, kind of from the standpoint of where we're coming from with time energy theory, caring about people having time and energy for their loved ones to discover their talents and all of this kind of stuff. But in that conversation, we brought on guest after guest of people who were various stripes of theists, and they were profound people. And a lot of them are friends. A lot of them were already friends. A lot of them have become friends since then. And we've done a few others. We had you on for a special epic marathon live stream at Theory Underground last year as well to talk about this. But Anne was not present for that, and she's been thinking a lot about the God question as well. And so I kind of want to just pass it over to her to set her up to ask the one question she's been asking everybody. And then we'll bring it into some follow ups that'll dig more into your work.
Awesome. Yeah. So at Theory Underground, we have been, like I mentioned earlier, kind of exploring religion and various denominations from, in part, an anthropological lens, partly to just understand what these beliefs are, what some of these schools of thought are, and what people are saying. We also want to just get plugged into, but also understand the communities that come out of these churches, what's good about them, how they build community. So there is this kind of more theoretical approach and lens, but then there's also a personal desire to maybe be more religious or have faith or some spirituality kind of present in my life a little bit more. Um, Especially just as we're settling down a little bit. We're hoping to start a family soon. And it's always been a question and I think a desire that I've had for a long time. When I was younger, when I was like in middle school, I was plugged into like a youth Christian organization after school. And I just wanted so badly to like have this relationship with God and Jesus that some of these mentors had. And so we went to this summer camp in Oregon. I had like water slides and games and everything. But it also was just, yeah, emphasized so much this, relationship with God and Jesus. And if you can hear him and he sends messages, and I'm a very like logistical kind of literal person. And so I'm like, okay, what am I supposed to be seeing? What am I supposed to be feeling? And so never experiencing that coinciding with in school for the first time learning about the Holocaust, like the first time being ever really confronted with a major event in world history of just pure evil and tragedy. Um, those two things coinciding, I gave up being religious. Um, and just it's kind of I've never not believed in God. I think I've always considered myself more agnostic, just like, oh, I'm open to whatever. I think there's some energy, some good vibes out there. I don't know. But I've just always found myself being so curious about what other people mean by God, what their relationship is to God, to Jesus, to religion, what role that plays in their life, especially people who are not just true believers, although that is interesting to understand from their perspective as well. So people who are a bit more critical, who have a theoretical or philosophical background and lens looking at it. And so I guess it's a big question, but the question to you is what is God or Jesus to you? What role does religion play in your life? How do you conceptualize it? How do you see it and view it?
Yes, there. Just a small question like
Stirring the
that.
coffees
Very
in here.
good. Very good. Yeah, I would love to dive in and have this conversation with you and have a back and forth. The I'll start off with some provisional thoughts to kind of contextualize maybe where I am a little bit, and then it might be interesting for me to define, I think, three dominant ways of defining God that are sophisticated. Three sophisticated means the apophatic, the existential, the radical, I would call them. So I can kind of do that. But the first thing maybe I should say is that, for me, uh, what I'm interested in is not Christianity as a worldview, as a set of beliefs, but rather as a mode of being in the world. That for me, I'm interested in what Christianity is in terms of a form of life, not even a form of life, a form of being in the world. Uh, and so I'm not operating with the traditional theistic and atheistic models. I say we can talk a little bit about that in a second, but the first thing might be to say, maybe to say what that form of life is. For me, the form of life, the way of being in the world that we experience in the contemporary world, but I think there's versions pre the contemporary world, is that we are caught up in a desire for full jouissance, for full pleasure, full enjoyment. It might be romantically, as in a romantic partner who will fulfill us. It might be politically, a utopia where the world will be amazing. It might be theological, a heaven where everything will be wonderful. So we have this desire, we experience ourselves as divided, as alienated, and we fantasize a full jouissance, a full enjoyment. And we work to try to, we struggle and we sacrifice in order to get that jouissance. Lacan actually used Pascal as the ultimate version of this because he renounces all earthly pleasure on the wager of a heavenly kind of unity with God in the future. So, but for me, that's the capitalist mode of desire, the commodity, or it might be polyamory, or it might be psychedelics, it doesn't matter. Right? There's something that will make us whole and complete. The form of life that I'm interested in what I call religionless Christianity, um, is a liturgy, which is a form of almost like an artistic, saturated space that you enter into that uses music and spoken word and ritual, that that helps us become freed from this frenetic pursuit of wholeness, completeness, certainty, and satisfaction. It is where we become, where we tarry with an ontological mystery, an ontological question, where we embrace doubt, complexity, and ambiguity, and we enjoy that not having that doubt, that complexity, that ambiguity. And for me, that frees us from the way of being in the world that most of us inhabit and allow us to have a different mode of being, which is a mode of being in which we embrace our finitude, we embrace our struggles and our doubt and our unknowing. That's a long way to say, for me, that's what I mean by the word Christianity, an invitation into a freedom from the frenetic pursuit of certainty and satisfaction. But we can now start talking about God if you want. Take me anywhere you want. Do you want to ask anything about that, or will I just jump in on God?
Yeah, I guess I'm curious, like, in what way that Christianity guides this approach versus just a secular, or say, I use philosophy, I use theory to get me to this freedom from wanting perfection. Yeah, what is
Yes.
the benefit of the faith-based
Yes.
approach?
Oh yeah, this is exciting. I mean, by the way, we could be here all night. I won't do that. My wager, I have a genealogy. So my genealogy of what's called the death of God, very simply, is the Apostle Paul says there's something about the death of God that's salvatory. Then Luther makes it theological. So St. Paul, it's cultic. It's a small, and then Luther makes it theological. Then Hegel raises it to the dignity of philosophy. Then Nietzsche makes it existential, that you have to pass through the death of God. So very similar to the Paul. Then Freud and Lacan create the technology of the death of God, I would argue. But then what's the next step? For me, there is no liturgy of the death of God. There is no church. There is no death drive denomination. So, and why is that? Why is that important? Here's my wager, is you can't get here intellectually. Well, intellectually is fine, and you can get here in lots of different ways. But having a liturgy in which you experience what I would call the alienation or the dividedness of reality, the ontological mystery, right? Through music, through art, through spoken word, and through ritual that you go to every week. Through that experience, you introject that. And through that introjection, it allows you to transform your way of being in the world. And it's not primarily intellectual. So, for example, Christian atheism, there's a lot of Christian atheism. In fact, the first systematic atheist was a priest, Jean Meslier. He wrote the first systematic account of atheism. Atheism has always been very closely connected with Christianity. But beside the point, what was I saying there? Oh, yes, the Christ crucified. There's a really interesting thing that happens in the way that that's told is Christ says, my God." So Christ talks to God. So it's not a theoretical atheism. It says, "Why have you abandoned me?" Christ experiences an existential absence of the absolute, not an intellectual absence, but undergoes what can be called subjective destitution. Well, they can't call subjective destitution. So for me, there's two types of religious experience. There's enlightenment and there's subjective destitution. And I am very against enlightenment, right? There's this thing, I lived in LA for years, and a religious experience is something wonderful. You go to a mountaintop, you take 5-MeO, or you take psychedelics, whatever, you have this wonderful experience. It's wonderful, it's great, it's warm, it's brilliant, it's enlightening. But no, subjective destitution is the idea that religious experience is fundamentally horrific. You don't want it because it destabilizes your entire way of being in the world. It is not an addition. It's not a way of comfort. It completely collapses you. So think of Nietzsche's parable of the madman. It's where the earth is loosed from its sun, where it is where we don't no longer have a compass, right? So subjective destitution. And I'm saying, oh yes. So I'm going like that experience of subjective destitution is not intellectual, it's existential.
Okay,
And
yeah.
that's why I think the church is so important. That's why, I work on I'm creating what's called Church of the Contradiction, which is liturgical experiences in which people can be invited into this subjective destitution, not at an intellectual level. It's not a philosophy class. It's a way of encountering your own divided nature, and being able to create a social bond around it. And I call this communion. Because a community is a group that has social solidarity around a shared belief, shared values, shared practices, and shared enemies. A communion is a social bond forged around the fact that we are all lacking, we are all incomplete, we all don't know, right? There's a fundamental unknowing. They're very, very different, community and communion. And again, communion is not an intellectual endeavor. Communion, I believe, is a kind of like a religious practice. I call it a religionless practice, but it is a type of religious practice.
I like this distinction a lot, and I think it goes well with our experience yesterday. Yesterday was our
Yeah, that's
second.
what I was.
Yeah, take it away. Do it. Yeah, talk about
Yeah, I'll
our.
turn it over to you,
Yeah,
but it was made me think about our experience yesterday at a Catholic church. And we went to a Catholic mass, and we both were thinking when we got out, we are like, this was our favorite one that we've been to because we went to a different Catholic mass. It was like the weekend that they elected the new pope. We've gone to a Baptist church. We've gone to the Universalist Unitarian Church, which had like eight old people in a gym. So we've gone to like the big kind of mega church with the giant building and kids area and tennis courts. So we're just checking out different places. But the Catholic church yesterday it was beautiful, like these stained glass windows. And it was our favorite experience because of the ritualistic part about it. Um, because everyone was doing this all at the same time and we weren't being lectured like some of these other ones where you're kind of, yeah, being given a lecture that's intellectually challenging or they're trying to present, here's some science, here's some facts, we're refuting pop. It was just like some beautiful words. We sing some songs, not, pop music or rock songs. Like you're just totally pulled out of your everyday. And it was like meditative and just, we really liked the experience. Yeah, maybe Dave, you can go more on or
I
on
would
more
just
about
I
that.
would just add that this was the closest. This idea of doing anthropology in the United States comes from the realization that we're all within the post-class fractured mass, and the more online we are, the more our identities are in the niches, and that means that your neighbor is more of a stranger and alien to you than somebody you might meet across the planet, and so like the idea of alien anthropology is like going into going out your door and going into communities and almost in a sort of phenomenological way, bracketing out the assumption that we have so much in common. Like, okay, so we know what Nike and McDonald's are. I can probably assume you all know what that is, but like, we don't really have a canon. We don't really have like a shared set of anything really outside of brands. And so, what do we really know about each other? And that's the mindset we're trying to have go into these places, but it's really hard to have that mindset when you go into like a Baptist church and they're doing like apologetics or whatever. And it's like, because in that situation, it's like, not only have I heard all this 1,000 times before, so it is a lot closer to home, but also it definitely doesn't invite me to get outside of my ego. My ego that is defensive and competitive and structured within fields of evangelical churches and places that form in reaction to leaving those. Like that is what's getting triggered in those spaces. Whereas in this kind of a space, it's like, this is actually alien to me. And I was gonna say that what really stood out was that this was the most like visiting temples and monasteries in Thailand kind of experience I've had since I don't know when that was, something like 2017. And part of it was because the monk, he didn't just say or the monk, I'm sorry, he's not a monk, the priest didn't just say things. He actually sounded like these Thai monks. So he'd be like, and it's like, and I'm like, you don't have to pay too much attention to whatever he's saying. If you do, it makes sense that he's saying those things. But it's like, but it is much more about this curated kind of experience that you're describing. And so I think, yeah, this gets at the idea of liturgy, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And out of all of the, traditions that you mentioned, the Catholic Church has, a very great reverence for mystery, for unknowing. And you even have like a wounded God is often, if not always, I think in a Catholic church, you see a Christ with wounds. So you have a
Mm.
wounded God, like basically what you could call a castrated God in many ways, but a God that is wounded, that is not whole and complete. And often, of course, you can go to Catholic churches where there's a Latin Mass and you don't even understand the words. Even more so, you're really experiencing an embodied mystery, a kind of an unknowing that is very key. And this is vital. I mean, this is my main defense of why religion is important. Traditional theism says God exists, and traditional atheism says God does not exist. But there is this idea that God is the name of the inexistent thing. God is the name of a fundamental mystery that cannot be signified. And there are forms of this within Catholicism. Within Catholicism, actually, it's very much within what's called the apophatic tradition. Um,
Right.
and and by the way, it's not all like there's also the existential, but the church does have a very close connection, as you guys know, with the apophatic. And this actually, like the classical definition of God is really interesting. The classical, like the basic definition of God comes really from Anselm, from his Proslogion. And it is basically God is that than which none greater can be conceived. Now, Anselm then goes on to unpack that. And he unpacks it in a really interesting way. He says, God is not the greatest conceptual thing. Because if God is the greatest conceptual thing, you can think of something greater than God, which is something beyond conception. But you can't have something greater than God because God is that than which none greater can be conceived. And I can conceive of something beyond conception. And therefore, God must be beyond conception. So this is really, God is the privileged, what's called master signifier, right? Which is a signifier that signifies something that cannot be signified. So the three-letter word God is a name for that which cannot be named. It is a placeholder for an ultimate mystery, an ultimate unnameable.
Mm.
And a lot of people kind of don't get that or whatever, but that's the standard apophatic name of God. And what's interesting about that is in a world of pure positivity, where it's all about seizing the day, being an entrepreneur of the self, life hacking, and all of this stuff that creates all these symptoms like fatigue and burnout and all that. Um, you've got, I would say, religion at its best it protects negativity. It protects an ultimate mystery, an ultimate unknowing, something that not only you can't get, but something that is impossible to get. And it's so impossible to get that you can't even strive for it. What you do is you tarry with it. What you do is you create space for an absolute mystery at the heart of everything. Now, I think there's mathematical definitions of this. I think you can find a definition in physics and chemistry and biology. It's in every discipline, and we can talk about that, but we're talking theologically here, where God is the name of that which cannot be named. In other words, religion at its best is a protection of nothing. It is that which allows a space in which we encounter a fundamental mystery. Uh, I'm interested in this because as a Lacanian, I'm interested in how what sparks off the unconscious and our drive is the mystery of the other's desire. That what kind of like ultimately fuels us is what does the other want? What do they want from me? What is the other's desire? And it's impossible to answer. And this impossibility is what drives us. It's what creates all these great and terrible things. But there is a fundamental mystery that sparks us as individuals. But theologically speaking, the apophatic tradition had this, which is religion at its best is not an evolutionary thing that's useful to, say, create community, or it's not a way of like having an explanation for stuff that we don't yet know, or these kind of various things. At its best, religion is a response to a fundamental mystery, and a respect for and a fidelity to that fundamental mystery.
Mm. Now, I want to. So you had said earlier that there's the apophatic, existential, and radical ideas of God, and I'm guessing yours is in the radical tradition,
Yes,
but
yes. So
you
I'm in the radical tradition.
but you're
Yeah.
saying you like things about the apophatic. What is the existential then?
Yeah, so I'd love to go into that. So I'll say a couple of final things to wrap up the apophatic, and then
Oh,
that will
okay, yeah,
really
yeah, yeah.
set up the X. Oh yeah, but yeah, because I want to get to that. And I love all of these because the apophatic, the existential, and the radical all have a space for negativity, all have a space for atheism, for radical negation. So the apophatic tradition is the idea of that. So God is that which is beyond being. Religious experience, I just want to mention that very quickly, is religious experience for the apophatic tradition is generally what's called a saturated event. It's something where you're overwhelmed, all your senses are blown apart. And so the encounter with the absolute is an encounter that you cannot conceptualize and you cannot experience. So weirdly, religious experience is not an experience of something, it's what it transforms your experience of everything. But it is not itself an experience, it's a counter experience, it's an overwhelming thing. And in terms of the mental, as I say, it's you can't. It's very similar to what, or it's very much what Kant said about the sublime. There's the what did he say? There's the mathematical sublime and there's the dynamic sublime. I think those were the two. The mathematical sublime is when you're basically your mind is blown by something like infinity. You can't conceptualize infinity. And the dynamic sublime is whenever there is such a great uh, thunderous event that your senses are overwhelmed. So there are two overwhelming experiences. Religious experience is like that. It's like taking 5-MeO or something like that. And then the church is the place that invites you into this experience. And it's a negative experience precisely because you're overwhelmed. It's very similar to Freud's first notion of trauma. His seduction theory of trauma, Freud thought, and actually a lot of psychology people still think this, is that a trauma is what happens when an event occurs in your life, an overwhelming event, often some sort of abuse, that you cannot symbolize, you cannot signify. So, in other words, you're overwhelmed by something that you cannot put into a signifying chain. So you carry you something happens and it's so overwhelming that you cannot conceptualize it. That's kind of the religious notion of the apophatic. The existential, I think, is even more interesting. So the you take someone like Simone Weil uh, or Paul Tillich, and what their view is they say God is not beyond being. God is the ground of being. And so what they say is, and I think Jordan Peterson tries to make this argument, but he just can't do it. He's just, but I think if you strong man them or whatever enough, I think this is what he's trying to argue. I watched that thing he did recently, which is a
Yeah,
disaster,
yeah.
Jubilee. But yeah, but if I really try to give him the best benefit of the doubt, I think he was trying to say something like what I'm about to say, which is. Um, Everything arises out of a ground. So the word God, the signifier God, signifies that which lies at the foundation of everything, subject and object, being and nothing, and space and time, right? So God is the name of a fundamental ground. Again, you're not really naming something, you're naming a ground, it cannot be named. And it cannot be named because as soon as you name something, it's an object, and by being the ground, it's pre-object subject. But here's the funny thing for Simone Weil. Comes from the Kabbalah tradition as well. It's like, so what's the first? So let's call it the singularity. What is the first act of the singularity? And Simone Weil says, well, contraction. The first thing that God has to do, because God, let's say, before everything is everything and nothing. So the first thing God has to do is contract. God has to, what Freud would call, but engage in primary narcissism, has to contract into itself, which is really interesting. I think you can build a theodicy out of this. The first act of God is evil, right? If you think of narcissism as contraction into yourself and love as reaching out to the other, and you base ethics, that's how I would base ethics, is you either contract into the same or you're able to embrace the other. So, and in Freudian terms, the infant becomes evil, right? But contracts into itself, differentiates, and therefore loves. I was talking to Helen the other day, who I know you've had on, and she was saying, like, all kids are evil, and basically what you have to do is the love cure. If you're wanting to start a family, this is the love cures. You have to draw the child out of their narcissistic shell into the world. And if we fail to do that, the child might struggle to do that. And I think things like psychoanalysis then are required as a way to try to pull you out of your narcissism. All that to say, anyway, that for Simone Weil, the first act of God is contraction to allow space for everything else. Now, here's the clever bit. Um, so, the first act of God is the death of God. So, the first act of God and the last act of God is to die, because if God is everything and then God contracts, then God is less than God. So, God's first act is the death of God. Hence, the crucifixion is just a kind of historical representation of the very beginning of time, that God dies, God contracts in order for everything to exist. Therefore, and this is really clever, for someone like Paul Tillich, he says religious experience is not like the apophatic, right? The apophatic is you have one religious experience or two if you're luckier, or maybe half a dozen, right? But you could write it down. Oh, it happened to me on the 12th of June. I had this experience. Great. It happens occasionally to some people. Someone like Rudolf Otto starts his book, The Idea of the Holy, and says, if you haven't had that saturated, he doesn't call it saturated, but if you haven't had that holy experience, you probably aren't going to be interested in religion, right? Religion really starts from, oh my God, what happened? That's where it starts, right? But for existentialism, religious experience is happening to everybody all the time, in every
Mm,
moment, because religious experience is the experience of the loss of God. Religious experience, so God contracts so that everything can be. So everything is marked by a desire. Everything is marked by a sense that something's missing. Everything is marked by a sense that we're not whole and complete. That sense is the religious experience. Now we cover over it, we deny it, we make it contingent, we think something will fill it, right? But for Tillich, the religious experience we're all having all the time by dint of being desiring subjects. And therefore, the the role of the church is to help us just uh, enjoy the religious experience that we're already in, and also in our desire for truth, beauty, and justice, right? The three main things, right? The truth, the philosopher, beauty, the artist, and justice, the activist, right? In our desire for these things, we are we are embracing religious experience. And then Tillich would say demonic religious experience is when we think we have the truth, it becomes false. If we think we have beauty, it becomes ugly. If we think we have justice, it becomes unjust. So that'll be very Caputian. Yeah, I know you had Caputo on. So although he's radical, he does have a Tillichian dimension to him, and so
Right.
there's a sense in which, yeah, the
He
desire for
referenced
truth.
he referenced Tillich multiple times, which was a really cool
mhm.
thing. We just had him on last week, so it's kind of a perfect follow up to have you here.
Brilliant. And by the way, Caputo, just to say, like, one is he is a great intellect and he is an even more beautiful person. He is so kind and so generous and so smart, and he's been so good to me. And the world will be a poor place without him. So I
Mm-hmm.
wish him long life and healthy life. And no matter how long he's here for, it won't be enough. But yes, but Paul Tillich, that's the idea. Truth, beauty, justice. We seek them, but we never get them. We have this longing and this desire. That's religious experience. That's really what I would call the existential notion of God. That's also about negation. But whereas for the apophatic, negation comes from an excess of experience, an excess of the absolute. In existentialism, it comes from being marked with the loss of the absolute. So there's two different kind of textures and feelings to them. Um, and yeah, and I'm influenced by both, but the radical is slightly different again. But do you want to ask anything about the existential or?
I'm wondering how and maybe this is getting a little ahead. Maybe we should finish this part out. But I will want to kind of bring in grace and forgiveness, which seem to be especially emphasized in Christianity, and
Yes.
I'm wondering, because since I've never really studied theology properly, I'm just wondering about how the different conceptions of God and also the sort of major splits in denominations and sects um, are practicing or theorizing grace
Yeah.
and forgiveness.
Grace and forgiveness. Yeah, I mean, these are favorite topics of mine. Now, by the way, what I'm talking about, if I had once I did a talk and somebody at the end of it who had never gone to church said, "Oh, I'm going to have to go to my local church." After hearing how I described religion, I was like, "You're not going to find these ideas in your local church."
Yeah.
Like, yeah, I don't want to
Right.
give the idea that these are, but there's elements of them definitely. But grace is
Mhm.
interesting to me because it's the opposite of self-help. So self-help gets you from A to B, right? Self-help is about, I want to write a book. How do I write a book? Or I want to get a partner. How do I get a partner? And self-help kind of helps you get from A, which is not having the book or not having a partner, to B, right? And it gives you advice, it gives you whatever, right? And it's about will, right? You through force of strength and good advice, you get from A to B. Grace is different because grace is not about getting from A to B. Grace is about staying at A, right? In grace, you accept that you're accepted. You don't have to do anything. The whole point of grace is that I say it's not just acceptance. Paul Tillich says grace is the acceptance that you're accepted. AA is a great example. You go to AA, you sit in a room, and you're accepted, and eventually you accept the acceptance of everybody in the room. And you say, I'm an alcoholic, and nobody judges you because everybody is experiencing uh, the same the same issue, right? So grace is this sense in which you don't have to change. And of course, the first thing people say is, well, if you don't have to change, why would anybody change? But of course, the counterintuitive logic is that in not having to change, you're able to change. In not having to, so it's like whenever people are defensive. If I see you're being nasty to your mum and I say you're being a real asshole to your mum, your defenses go up and you say, yeah, but she's awful. You don't know what she's like to live with, right? And you defend yourself.
Mhm.
But if I'm super nice and I'm just going, oh, you seem to be having a really rough time. I'm really sorry. Do you want to talk about it? Oh God, and I know that probably puts stress on your relationship with your mum and all that. You're more likely to go, yeah, I know I was really nasty to her, I really shouldn't have, right? So in the very me not asking you to
Mhm.
change, but just creating this space of grace, change could happen. And the way change happens in grace, and this does connect more with the radical, which is the third one we'll look at, is that in grace you stay at A. This is attention, by the way. Shimon Weil calls it will, self-help will, and this grace attention. You become attentive to yourself. You listen, and you realize that A does not equal A, which means you realize that you're a divided subject. You realize perhaps you haven't written the book because you don't want to. You do want to write the book, but also you don't want to write the book. Maybe you want to stay silent. I once had a girlfriend who called round to me. She called to my door to tell me that she didn't want to speak to me, and then she left, right? Which I thought was brilliant. She didn't not speak to me.
Yeah.
She drove all the way over Belfast to go to my door to say, I don't want to talk to you. And that's very different from not talking. Um,
Right.
so in a similar way, somebody might want to write a book, but actually what they do is they want to not write the book, which means maybe they want to stay silent, that there's something maybe they felt that it's a protest about to their parents or whatever, but they don't even realize that. In grace, you realize you're divided. You have two desires fighting each other. You accept them, you begin to symbolize them, and in doing that, you're able to find a way to actually write the book. So technically, not trying to get it, because here's the thing about advice about romantic relationships and books. We all know it already. You can look up, you can ask ChatGPT in 30 seconds, it'll tell you everything that the best advisor could tell you. The problem is we don't want to do it because there's some part of you that's fighting it. If every time your mind goes blank when you sit down to write, right? There's some part of you that doesn't want to write, but you're not aware of it. But grace allows you to just be, to listen to yourself, to come to know your contradictory desires. And in doing that, it actually allows for emancipation and freedom. So that's how I understand grace. Um, Forgiveness, very quickly, I'll do a wee thing on forgiveness and then wherever you want to go next. Forgiveness is interesting because if you think of paying a debt and forgiving a debt, they're very, very different. If you owe me $100 and someone pays that debt, they basically take the nothing. So a debt is a type of not having money is nothing. Having a debt is a nothing that is something. It's a not it's less than nothing. It's so it's more
Mhm.
powerful. And if you owe money, and in 2008, myself and a lot of friends owed a lot of money, when the housing market collapsed and you got letters demanding that you pay that debt, and it causes stress, it causes anxiety, everything, right? If someone pays that debt, they fill the lack. If someone forgives the debt, they don't fill the lack. They say that the nothingness is nothing. The nothingness that is something is nothing. So, and this is very, very key in terms of if I say that we all experience a lack, a sense of longing, right? We all are divided subjects. We feel a longing, we feel incomplete, we feel alienated. We believe there is something that can fill that lack, to pay it, to put it in, right? Say money, psychedelics, whatever, we can fill it, right? To forgive a debt is not to take away the nothing, but to render the nothing nothing, to take away its weight. So for me, again, the whole point of the radical liturgy is to realize that this lack that you feel, this alienation that you feel, to be freed from the fantasy that it can be filled, but to render it nothing. That is the experience of forgiveness for me.
Mm. Wow. That- I don't have an immediate question or follow-up to that. I really like all of that. And I guess I just want to hear more about this radical liturgy.
Wonderful. I
Yeah.
feel bad because I've said there's three things I want to do, and so I'm kind of just going to plow through. But every now and again, I just stop so that you can
Go
say,
for
"Tell us
it.
about the next one."
Yeah, no,
Yeah,
for
yeah,
real.
yeah.
We're just
Great,
playing a
great.
game. It's just for the people who are listening or watching. But thank you,
Right.
Radical, and then we can go anywhere
I'll
you guys want.
Sweet.
I'll just say one thing before
Yeah.
we dive into it. Then, basically, I really like this distinction between grace and self help, and uh, and it makes sense that Simone Weil would talk about the self help way as will, right? Because we think will is this thing that we go, oh, we need to make ourselves do the thing, and of course that's where will comes in. It's like I gotta will myself to do it, and a lot of the best things don't come from willing them to happen. And going back to the desire versus drive sort of tension, where they're both on a what's the Mobius strip, right? You've got like this desire for perfection, for peace, for harmony, and of course drive is going to come in there and mess that all up, right? And it
Yeah.
seems like, and a big part of Lacanian psychoanalysis is sort of based on this, that the symptoms only get worse when you try to self-help that tension, and when you try to say, oh, let's use some cognitive behavioral therapy to get you to stop doing the death drive thing, and here you can practice these practices and will yourself to counter those tendencies. And that can work for a while, but eventually it backfires, and death drive comes back with a vengeance, and it comes back worse, or it manifests, or you fix you take care of the symptom, but then it resurfaces in some new way. There's some new manifestation.
Yeah. Oh, I've seen people who used to drink too much and then something terrible happens and they start to do CrossFit. Yeah, exactly. It just fucking changes. The symptom changes to
Mhm.
something horrible, right? Yeah. You
Yeah,
don't fix it, it just shifts. Anyway, keep going.
it just
Yep.
shifts over, right? And so the idea of grace is coming into this different relation to your desire and your drive. So becoming a little less perfectionistic, but also becoming a little less guilty and self-flagellating for the ways that you undermine that perfection.
Yes. Yeah, to use the example of psychoanalysis, that was brilliantly said, is that so the difference between counseling, some forms of therapy, and psychoanalysis proper is that, counseling counsels. right? And it works on the idea that we want to be better. It's almost like a utilitarian kind of like we want pleasure, we want to minimize pain, and get some good counseling. Some therapies are similar. Freud moved from being a psychotherapist to being a psychoanalyst when he discovered the death drive, right, 1920 or whatever. But in psychoanalysis, right, so if I come to say hypnotherapy or something like that, and I say, right, I drink too much. So I know the problem. I drink too much. I know the solution. I want to drink less, and I'm here to get some techniques. That can sometimes work. I don't want to disparage some of the cognitive therapies. That sounds interesting. But what happens in psychoanalysis is I know what the problem is, drinking, and I know what I want to do, stop drinking, and I'm here for you to help me. And then you go into psychoanalysis and you just start talking, and you realize that after 6 months or 3 months of psychoanalysis, you have not really talked about the alcohol at all. But you talked about, for example, oh, when I was young, I was separated from my mother very early, sent to boarding school. And then you kind of go like, oh, the alcohol feels like it's like almost like whenever you have a baby who, after feeding at the mother's breast, looks drunk, right? Because the baby has this satiated thing, go like that. The alcohol is the experience of being at the mother's breast, and you realize the alcohol isn't the problem; it's the solution to a problem. And and you wouldn't have known that if you were trying to will to change. I want to stop being an alcoholic, right? And then you find out, yes, the alcohol says not the problem, it's the solution to a problem through talking, through just attention, through grace, the grace experience of you can say anything you want in that session and you're radically accepted. You speak, you begin to symbolize things. And weirdly, and this happens, I know I have a friend who was in analysis precisely because he was an alcoholic. And he was like, I didn't talk about the alcoholism at all. But he says, I drink less. I just don't, I'm not drinking as much. He said it almost happened behind my back. And I felt this in analysis as well. It happens behind your back. Because you don't even know the issue yourself. You don't even know what you desire. You said you desire to change. You don't desire to change. The alcoholic desires to drink. And until you realize that that desire is in you and why that desire is in you, you can't change. And here's the weird thing about psychoanalysis, as you both know, is there is no will. Right? If you have to will a change in your symptom, that's cognitive stuff, yeah. But you don't will the change. Interpretation unravels the symptom, or allows you to enjoy the symptom, but it dissolves. One example, by the way, a friend of mine had a terrible fear of spiders. And she had a dream about spiders, and me and her just sat down and we went through the dream and we interpreted it, and it connected with her father, and we just did this interpretation of the dream. A few months later, she calls me and she said the weirdest thing happened. She said, I woke up and there was a spider crawling on me. Wasn't afraid at all. I don't know why. And I don't even know why that interpretation did that. I have no idea. We just interpreted and played with the interpretations. But she said, whatever reason, I'm no longer scared of spiders. There was no will involved. There was acceptance. There was attention.
And
Yeah.
does this relate in any way to your experience with the chickens? Hate to interrupt, but we would be remiss to not share an advertisement from our sponsors. And we're not sponsored by any corporate or state entities other than ourselves. So I'll just tell you a little bit about some of the past courses and the ongoing courses here at TU. Because if any of them sound exciting to you, well, you can access all of them by becoming a subscriber. That's right, subscribers make all of this possible. Subscribers get access to the course I taught on Martin Heidegger's Being and Time, as well as the course that I taught the first half of last year, Emmanuel Levinas's Totality and Infinity, the second half for which I will be teaching this winter. I've also taught critical media theory and critical doxology and time energy with my wife, Ann Snellgrove McKerracher, who is the co-host on What's Right. Also, you would get access to the course I taught at the university, 3 semesters worth, on Intro to Critical Social Theory and Socioanalysis. But also, we've had lots of other great professors teach Introduction to Marxism by Chris Catrone, Intro to Lacan via Seminar 11 with Todd McGowan, Introduction to Ivan Illich with Brian Weeks, The Clinical Structures of Psychoanalysis and Autism with Dr. Leon Brenner, the Michael Downs Seminar, Introduction to Slavoj Žižek, Introduction to Nick Land, and Žižek's For They Know Not What They Do, all taught by Michael Downs, as well as What is Sex? There was a collab that I did with Cadell Last. Theory 101, a collab I did with Hello Gorgias. And then also, of course, there's Carl Jaspers' Is the Idea of the University, PMC Consciousness and Ideology. These were early, very important courses that I taught with friends at TU back in 2023. And they remain important to this day. Every one of these courses comes out of an overarching research project. There's a real driving force, mission, and agenda to the research going on at TU because we want to understand the situation for the sake of large-scale structural change focused on the good life. What does that actually mean? If you really want to go deep, obviously, these courses are something you could spend the better part of a year binging while at work. Ongoing courses that come out on a monthly basis are the Fundamental Problems and Core Concepts at TU with yours truly, also my seminar, Philosophy of Nature with Nina Power, the Benjamin Studebaker seminar, as well as his course, The 12 Political Theorists. We've got some really exciting stuff coming down the line. The only way to make this all possible and really deepen your knowledge and familiarity with all of these different things is to become a subscriber today at http://theoryunderground.com/subscribe. Thank you.
To my experience of not being afraid of spiders.
No
I was like,
chickens.
hi.
Yeah.
Oh, of chickens?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Chickens and spiders.
Yeah,
You
let's
got
go with
it.
both. Let's go with both, yeah.
I used to be deathly afraid of spiders. Like, if there was one on the wall, I'm like, nope, I have to leave the room. Someone else has to deal with it. And then one night, I got a little stoned, and I like just finished listening to some like vegan activist podcast. This was like 2019 or something. And she was talking about how like she's vegan because she cares about animal liberation and we should treat animals as our comrades. And I was like, spiders are just our little comrades. They're not hurting us. They're just trying to live their life. And like having that thought, I think while stoned, literally the next day I was like, I can put a cup over this and a piece of paper and take it outside. Whereas before I couldn't even like be in the same room. And yeah, with the chickens, I don't know. The chickens have been, because we're on this farm now, and there's chickens, and I've always been scared of chickens. They're too much like dinosaurs. They're freaky. Um, I think just like being around them, I don't know what's been going on subconsciously, but like forcing myself into the situation and like, this is fine. They're okay. They're not gonna hurt me.
That's very interesting, especially your experience of the spiders, because there's something about like so I'm not very I was living in LA for a while. When I was in LA, anthropologically, I had to do some drugs because everybody does drugs there, and I was, did what everybody else does, right?
Mhm.
The one that was most interesting to me was psilocybin, right?
Mhm.
And there I had an experience where I was on psilocybin. I have a weirdly high threshold, so I had to take a shit ton. But eventually it kicked in on my own. And I had basically a waking dream for 8 hours or whatever. And I came out of it, and two things happened. I no longer drank. This has been 3 or 4 years now. I haven't touched a drop of alcohol since. I didn't even drink very much. I wasn't a big drinker, so I wasn't doing it for a drink, but for some reason I stopped drinking. And I had fatigue and it disappeared. And what I kind of think was happening, I think maybe it was the same for you when you were stoned, is in you're rearranging signifiers. There's this you're an awakened dream.
Mhm.
A friend of mine who's a psychoanalyst says dreams um almost like when you can dream well, you're healthy. Nightmares are an inability to dream, right? Something
Mhm.
breaks down, but we're working stuff out in our dreams. So at some level, you maybe worked out something through
Right.
when you were stoned, and you don't even quite know what it was you worked out, but
Yeah.
it was worked out, and I
Yeah.
felt the same. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, it's so interesting.
Uh, Oh yeah, well, will we jump into the radical? Or sorry, Dave, do you want to jump in with that? Something else?
I have a follow up to these three dominant conceptions of God, but let's dive into the radical. Yeah.
Brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. And the reason why I'm saying all of these is to say because I'm interested in what protects negativity, the negative, and these are three that have a space for the nothing is something. So the third, which is the radical tradition, which people like Žižek, Todd McGowan, Richard Boothby, uh, is the idea that the absolute is divided. So in apophatic, the God is whole and complete, but is so vastly beyond being that we cannot grasp God. So we're left in the dark with negation. In the existential, God, I said in Simone Weil, kind of God dies. I did that. Tillich, it's not quite the same, but God is the ground of being. And so we have a more radical experience of negativity. It's not a negativity that comes from plentitude and excess. It's a negativity that is in which we are marked by a fundamental loss. In the radical tradition, and say Žižek is the best example of this, really, it's the idea that no, the absolute is also alienated from itself. We call this Trinitarian theology. Obviously, it's a traditional term for it. God is not one, right? God is not one. God is not two. God is the not one, um, and that pans out as three, right? Because you have you have God, which is not one, so there's two, and then there's this dash itself. That's three: Father, Son, Holy Ghost, um, and the idea here, and this is the most radical, and I think this is what gives us the most radical reading of grace and forgiveness, is if the absolute is divided, which really just is a way of saying that reality, being itself, is asymmetrical, is in antagonism with itself. That fundamentally there is not some sort of wholeness and completeness. That is a fantasy that we put on reality, but reality is fundamentally alienated, and that's where all the fun stuff comes from, right? If that is the case, then when you and so Zizek says it like this, right? What is the joke of Christianity, right? The joke of Christianity is that someone goes into church, they're distraught, they're crying, and they get on their knees and they say, God, I want to be one with you, but I am destitute, I am alone, I am alienated, I am abject. And God says, ah, my child, you are one with me. Right, that's the joke of Christianity. And that's what every great movie is about. Really, is like a great movie. Shit movies are about getting objet of getting the thing right. But a great movie like Wizard of Oz or whatever is realizing that the wizard is just like you, or Citizen Kane, Rosebud is just a sledge. Sorry for ruining it for anybody, but it's been out for a while. It's kind of your encounter the sense in which, oh, I want to overcome my alienation, but actually my alienation is redoubled in reality itself. And in Lacanian terms, there's two things that are important. They're called separation and alienation. The first is when the child separates from the mother other, right? And yet they want to rebind. If that doesn't happen, psychosis, right? If there's a split, the child wants to go back and be reabsorbed into the mother, right? That's separation, and that's perversion if that doesn't move, right? For Lacanian, right? And then alienation is where you realize that you can't be everything to the mother other because they are alienated from themselves. And in this third space, in realizing that the other is alienated as well, your own alienation you can bear and you can begin to enjoy. Right. So that's the three moves. And I see this in the movement of the Bible itself. There is the kind of like, Darren Aronofsky's Noah is very good on this, like a psychotic relationship with the absolute other, right? Where God is speaking and there all the time. Then there's the covenants, where God is separated through covenants, because contracts are not there to bind you to someone, but to protect you from their desire, right? So if you're in a business partnership and you're all friends, that's great, but you need a contract because desires change, and contracts are there to protect you from the ever-changing waters of the other's desire, right? So the covenants were there to protect you from God's enigmatic desire. And then in the crucifixion, you realize that God is divided. So we're not just separate from God through the covenants, but God is separate from God as well, and that's the collective of the Holy Ghost. That's whenever, that's basically a new form of being. So in radical theology, the notion is the absolute is divided. Religious experience is embrace of our own dividedness as mapped onto the absolute. So we identify with the crucified Christ, right? And church is designed to help you, to help invite you into that radical alienation. And I'll say one final thing, because this for me is the key. This is what I've dedicated my life to, right? And it's a 500-year plan. I don't think I'm going to be there to see it through, but I'll be there at the beginning, right? Is what Lacan calls the hysterics discourse. And I don't know if you've done the 4 discourses in your kind of group yet, but a little tiny bit, you touched on it. But the very basically, Lacan, he talks about these 4 discourses. There's a couple, there's more, but he talks specifically about 4 that are connected. Master's discourse, university discourse, the analyst discourse, which is most important for Lacan, and the hysterics discourse. Very briefly, the master's discourse these are all social bonds, and master's discourse, as you will know, is where a master tells you what to do. So in therapy, if you have a therapist, he just basically tells you what you should do, which you do sometimes get in counseling or whatever. So that's kind of before counseling. Now, of course, Lacan doesn't want that, because in the master's discourse, the truth is the one who's giving you the advice is just divided like you. Right? That's the truth of the master's discourse. The university discourse is somebody giving you advice, right? Say it's a therapy where they're telling you, oh, you should break up with that person for these reasons, why this is not good for you. Here's some advice about how to live. You should be monogamous, or you should be polyamorous, or you should be single, whatever it is, some advice on how you do it. But Lacan rejects that as well, because even if it's good advice, it always comes from an ideology, a hidden ideology. So he rejects that. The analyst discourse, which is very most important for psychoanalysis, is that you're confronted with your own desire. The other doesn't tell you what to do, doesn't give you life advice, but is a blank slate upon which you project your desires, and you start to encounter your own desires. So that's why the analyst often sits behind you. You don't even see them. They say very little. They're almost like a presence that isn't present. They're this sense of which you're being looked at, but you don't see eyes, right? And then it allows you to kind of like start to project onto things. Anyway, the final one is the hysterics discourse. This is the one that's interesting to me. This is Church of the Contradiction. You have, very quickly, you have a divided subject who is the agent, who speaks to a S1, which is like, let's call it ideology. You've got a divided subject, an hysteric, who shouts at ideology. That creates knowledge. And what is behind the hysteric is object A. And if you can, I'll tell a little Jewish story that makes this very understandable for anyone who's listening to this. This is a little story I used to tell this 30 years ago. It was one of the first stories I ever told, but I kind of get a deeper sense of it now, but I always liked it. It's this student who comes to a rabbi, this young student in his 20s, goes to this old rabbi who's very well respected, knocks on his door. It's dinner time. The guy's eating, comes to the door, sees this young student. The student says, I want to learn about religion. I want to know about God. I want to know about the wisdom of the Jewish tradition. And the rabbi laughs, said, listen, you're too young, come back in 10 years, right? But the young student goes, no, I'm ready for this. I've studied symbolic logic, Aristotelian logic. I'm ready for this. I want to learn. So the rabbi goes, okay. I says, I'll ask you a question. If you answer this right, I'll let you in. He says, 2 guys come down a chimney. Now, one has soot on their face and one doesn't. Who washes their face? And the young guy says, well, the guy with the soot on his face. The rabbi says, no. The guy without the soot on his face. Why? Well, they come down the chimney and the person with the soot on their face looks at the other person, and because there's no soot on their face, they think they don't have soot. But the person without the soot on their face, they look at the other person and they see soot on their face, so they go, I must have soot on my face, and they wash their face, right? So he's about to close the door, and the student goes, no, ask me again, ask me something else, I'm really sorry, I'll try again. The rabbi goes, okay, I'll ask you another question. And if you answer it right, I'll let you in, otherwise clear off. He says, 2 guys come down a chimney, one has soot on their face, one doesn't. Who washes their face? And the student goes, oh, well, the guy without the soot on his face. And the rabbi stops him and says, stop trying to be clever, right? The one with the soot on their face. Yeah. You're not going to feel it in your eyes. You're not going to feel it in your mouth. You're not going to see it in your hands. Just don't be stupid. Go away. But the student persists. He goes, one more time. And the rabbi goes, okay, I'll ask you a different question. He says, two guys come down a chimney. One has soot in their face, one doesn't. Who washes their face? And the student's like, oh, well, was it my first answer for different reasons? And the rabbi stops him and says, they both wash their face. How can you not come down a chimney and not wash your face? Clear off and come back in 10 years. Right? So this is a little Jewish story. I love it. It's really good. It's really nice little Jewish parable. But
Yeah.
this for me is the key to what religion is. Well, what the church is that I'm trying to form, which is you have the rabbi who is the divided subject. In the if people want to look this up as I'm talking, look up the hysterics discourse and you'll see a little chart. In the top left hand side, you've got the divided subject. That's the rabbi, right? Why is the rabbi hysterical? Because the hysteric is the one who says different things, feels like an imposter, is always questioning, is not sure, right? So it's an hysteric rabbi, right? In the top right hand corner is S1. This is the student. Why is a student S1? Well, as Heidegger said, people think students are there to learn and teachers are there to teach. But no, students know everything, right? It's the teachers who you have to teach them that they don't, right? Because it's the teacher who doesn't know everything, right? It's the learning that tells you you don't know. And the funny thing about students, and Jean-Paul Sartre says this, is when you look for advice of somebody, think about why you're asking that person for the advice. Because the person you ask tells you what you want to hear, right? You don't know that, but like depending on whether you go to a certain religious person or secular person or a parent, you kind of generally know what advice you want to give. So the student is S1, they already kind of know. That's just exactly what I was saying about when you go to a therapist and you go, I know what the problem is, it's alcohol and I want you to stop it. And psychoanalysis helps you question whether that's really the issue. So the student is there solidly as S1, being confronted by the hysteric, the rabbi. What does this produce? S2 in this hysterics discourse, and S2 is knowledge. That hopefully this student starts to crack open their ideology, their way of seeing the world, starts to question themselves, starts to generate new ideas and think for themselves. And lastly, what's under the rabbi in this chart is A. And I would say A represents God. A is the unsymbolized object cause of desire. That the rabbi is fundamentally unknowing, fundamentally hysterical, because at the very core of his position is an unsayable, unknowable mystery. Um, Now, for me, Christ is the barred subject because Christ goes, my God, why have you forsaken me? God is, and this is why it's beyond theism and atheism because technically object A doesn't exist, right? But let's say it's the unsymbolizable real. And so what this means, and it confronts the congregation, which is S1, to create knowledge. Very quickly, sorry for doing all of that, but
No,
this
this
is
is
so,
amazing.
so,
This is good. Yeah.
okay, thank you. Because this is the core of my
Yeah, this is
project.
awesome.
um, is that I want to create a church where the liturgy is hysterical, where the liturgy embraces doubt, complexity, unknowing, mystery in the music, in the art, in the ritual, in the sermons, right? So that you, the congregation, who kind of, without knowing it, we have an ideology, of wholeness and completeness and all of that. We are confronted by an hysteric uh, discourse, an hysteric kind of liturgy that causes us to rethink and generate new ideas, and we start to enjoy not knowing, we start to enjoy the process of life itself. And what sustains this entire project is a fundamental ontological mystery. That's the work,
Mm.
that's the liturgy, that's the church.
I'm really excited to
I
see what happens in
really,
500 years, assuming I can get my
yeah.
as long as I can get my cyborg upgrades, hopefully I'll get to see it.
Yes.
Well,
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that approach, especially as it contrasts to, I think, the kind of types of religion and denominations that I tend to have the biggest problem with, that I've always had the biggest problem with, is the ones that just say, no, all you have to do is believe in God and then you'll go to heaven. And that's like at this Baptist church we went to, my jaw almost dropped at one point at something the pastor said, because he was saying, Christianity is not about how you live. Oh no, contrary to popular belief, it's not about action. It's just about believing that Jesus died for your sins and was resurrected on the third day. And if you just accept that into your life, then your only job is to spread that word to other people.
Right.
And I was just like, I grew up going to like a Methodist church, and just was surrounded by people sharing like, it's not just belief, it is how you live your life. What would Jesus do? Kind of living in that way. And so just this dogma of nope, just believe that this is true, that this is the fact. And if you just accept that into your heart and know that you will never be enough for God, but He loves you anyway, and that's the way it is, you're good to go. You'll be in heaven.
Yes.
And I
Yeah, I
just
mean that,
was so
yeah.
shocked by that.
Absolutely. Like that's kind of a master's discourse, which conservative churches often are. It's like divine command theory, but it's a master, it's someone telling you what to believe, but underneath that is a divided subject. And then
Mm,
progressive churches are often like university discourses because some progressive churches, I have some friends who are part of something called Vote the Common Good, which technically was about, just whenever you're voting, think about who to vote best for. But it was really about vote for the Democrats, right? That was it, was completely it. And what they were doing was they were trying to give advice. So it wasn't like that one where the Baptist Church where tell the master's discourse. It was a university discourse, giving you advice about how best to decide who to vote for. But underneath that was ideology. It was an ideology. So underneath the master's discourse is a divided subject. Underneath the university discourse is a ideology. And the really beautiful thing about the hysterics discourse and the analyst discourse is it neither of them tell you what to think or
mhm,
give you advice. Both of them, you generate that yourself. That's a key difference. Yeah, so
mhm.
it's a very key difference. But most churches, I think, are either master's discourses or university discourses,
Right.
rather than the
Yeah, and
analyst
they
discourse.
probably all fall into like a very political, ideological split. Like you were
Yeah.
saying, yeah, the conservative churches, whereas when we went to this Universalist Unitarian church, the kind of subtext was we all need to learn how to be kind to our enemies, which are conservatives. Basically,
Yes.
without saying it, that's
Without
what they
saying
were
it, I know
saying.
without saying it. It's a new
Yeah.
version of those churches say all are welcome. As soon as you read all are welcome, there's an unwritten list of who's not welcome. And progressives are
Mhm.
great at that. I have a good friend who was going to do a festival where everybody was welcome. That's what he said. Everyone was welcome. And I immediately listed off about 5 groups that they would have nowhere near that festival. But so like because there's always and Todd McGowan's book on alienation, which is brilliant. I
Mhm.
forget what it's called, but where he says like communities always have exclusion. Every community is built on exclusion, and this is where his work was about community in the commons. So community was shared beliefs, shared practices, shared values. The commons is the space where like a park where you meet people who could be radically different from yourself, a greyhound bus, that kind of stuff. But I want to add the third because the third is most important to me, which is communion. Communion is a social bond based on the fact that we don't have anything in common. It is literally based on the fact that we are all that there is a type of otherness that cannot be domesticated. And I believe and Julie Reich is brilliant on this. For Julie Reich, her whole thing is a social bond forged around the fact not that we share the same religion, the same beliefs, the same this or that, but that we are all longing, we're all riven with desire and ultimately drive. Yeah.
Now this is a nice segue into this question I have that I want to use to bring back Jordan Peterson just as a part of it because he's got an interesting sort of presence in
He
this
brought us
conversation.
together.
He brought us together.
He brought us together. Yeah, because
Right.
that was a Jordan Peterson critique of Peterson conference that you guys put on and invited me
Exactly.
to. So yes, let's get back
Right.
to him. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank
Not
you,
only
Jordan Peterson.
yeah, because I think my first exposure to you was you just doing some Facebook Live or Facebook recording, whatever. You just responding to something that Peterson had said or whatever, and you were, contrasting it to your approach, and so when we were putting together the people who would be there, or invited to JPCon, I remember I was like, we got to see if we can get this Rollins guy. Like that would be really cool. But I think a misunderstanding on the part of a lot of people who were not present or who maybe weren't really attentive, was that we just hated him. When in reality, it was very clear that most of the people involved had some kind of appreciation or respect for something that Peterson was doing. And different people, it would be different. Some people definitely got in, kind of, and they still just did their thing, and it was kind of just like the, oh, Peterson sucks. But they were not the main people. And in fact, the phrasing of the call for proposals was very like, we're not going to disagree with him on X, Y, and Z things. We're going to assume that's all correct and then proceed to wrestle with his ideas, and,
Yes.
so great examples of that, Emily Potest was taking on his way of thinking about mythology, and she was bringing in all of this stuff that she gets from studying myth, and it wasn't just like, oh, see, he's wrong. It was like, oh, let's just go deeper into myth. And your talk was amazing. Everybody can find that online, but he's getting a lot of flack. He's kind of the laughingstock of the internet in a lot of ways, because of this Jubilee appearance. And so I imagine it's not going so well for him, or that he's realizing that didn't go so well. But I feel very sympathetic, once again. I feel very sympathetic to his position that is like an impossible position that he's trying to hold in this situation. It got framed as a Christian versus atheism thing, and then some of these people taking turns arguing with him that are atheists, especially that one guy, basically kind of pins him down. Are you Christian or not? Like, what is this? Why are we here? I was under the assumption that I'm here to debate a Christian. And Peterson, I mean, what doesn't go so well for him is primarily his tone of voice, his demeanor, he's not having an easy time of it. But he also, people think he's being dodgy, or that he's refusing to take a stand. I've seen Christians saying that this was his moment to shine, that he really could have taken this stand in defense of Christianity. And then all these atheists thinking that he's duplicitous and that he's a coward. And this is where I'm sympathetic and also aware of his work. He's never been a Christian. He's never said that he's a Christian. He's been consistently saying, well, there's something there that atheists are throwing out. There's something there that atheists are oversimplifying. There's something there. And so when he teaches, his reading of the Bible, it's not like hey, I'm going to teach you that this is correct because I'm a Christian. He's like saying, no, let's take it seriously. And I think that the culture of Christianity versus atheism, and you were pointing out that these two things are very close together. They're intimate, right? Atheism is a particular response to a specific kind of theism. Especially in America, it's going to be a Christian kind. And in a lot of ways, that atheism is the mirror. It's the mirror reflection of a conception of God that is not any of the three you just laid out. All three that you just laid, right? All three that you just laid out, and all of the and all of the ideas of God that everyone has brought up on this podcast so far. Nobody's talking about this one that is the primary way of thinking about God, and that primary way of thinking about God is creating a lot of division and heartbreak. It tears apart families, and it results in a lot of this kind of atheism, which I would also say is stupid. It's a stupid kind of atheism. And I'm just going to go ahead and say that I speak for myself as a person who is really into new atheism, who is really into theism versus atheism. When I was in my undergraduate, I organized atheist people coming and giving talks on the campus, and the Campus Alive in Christ people were always praying for me, and they would show up in mass, and they'd all be sitting there muttering while we were having the debates or whatever, and they were like singing under their breath or praying under their breath like the whole time. It was like a very polarized kind of atmosphere that I was in, and in my mind I was doing this all for reason and truth and science. But in reality, the two sides present are symptomatic of something. What I want to bring it back to, because I know I've brought up a lot here, and you've got permission to go for at least another half hour if you want to. But I wanna complexify it a little bit by bringing in the Marxist sort of thing that I think is here for all of us, and it's the idea of the mode of production being a significant cause for a lot of the things that we see going on, right? The base, the mode of production has a serious role in everything, and ideology, insofar as it works, it's doing something to reproduce the relations of production. I'm curious what this primary conception of God, not the three you've laid out, but this primary idolatrous, sort of potentially evil idea of God does to reproduce the relations of production on both sides, on the conservative and the progressive sides, and how a lot of people thinking that they are doing the virtuous thing by reacting against that conservative side are doing something that's also very exclusive and also has a huge role to play in the reproduction of those relations.
Yeah, it's a great question. And to pick up on something you said and then jump into that is, yeah, all three of these positions that we've explored and I've laid out, the apophatic, the existential, the radical, they all critique the the classical, say, the kind of definition of God that is seen in every YouTube debate where there's a debate of a theist and an atheist. They all critique that as idolatrous, even evil, as non-God, right? So these three very sophisticated and integrate, like these, I'm not just picking these out of the air. These are theological positions. None of them, all of them reject this notion of God as what can be called a hyper being. So basically, you've got God as a hyper being, which is just, the best thing we can think of. There's God as beyond being, which is the apophatic, God as ground of being, and God as event, or God as rupture, right? And these three, God as hyper being is the classic kind of thing that most people are arguing about. These other three are not. They're kind of atheist, they're theological atheism, because they all negate that God. They all say that God is the name of something that cannot be named. So there's a fundamental negation in all of them. So yeah, and here's where, again, sorry to jump in on something else you said, which was great, is Peterson, and I really loved the conference for the very reason you said. It was a critique, but it was a powerful, caring critique, that one wants. We want, like, if someone ran a conference like that about me, I would be honored. It was not an attack; it was a reasoned critique. And I think I was talking about kind of just the difference between Jung and Lacan and all of that, right? But
Yeah.
what I think Peterson is doing at his best, like to steelman what Peterson's doing, um, is that in Jubilee, if you really listen carefully, what he's saying is he's trying to create an ontological argument, and all three of these are ontological arguments for the existence of God, really. Um, just like Hegel's entire work could be seen as an ontological argument for the existence of God. But what Peterson was trying to say, I think, is that, well, a couple of things. One is that whether or not I'm a Christian is not a belief; it's a way of being. It's so like he keeps going like, "What do you believe?" So but he's doing it in a fuzzy way. But he's trying to say like, "Hold on a second, we're talking like I can say I don't believe in ghosts, but if every time there's a crack at the knock at the window, I'm putting the duvet over my head, I do believe in ghosts. I just don't know it, right?" But more fundamentally, what Peterson's was trying to say is that everything we do is based on values. And when you go deep enough in those values, you hit the three big ones: truth, beauty, and justice. And what he didn't say, but I think he was trying to say, is that beneath those is the good. We all, in some respects, even a murderer is trying to do the good, even if it's about revenge, if it's about justice, if it's about getting personal gain, it's still their distorted way of the good, right? So right back, there's this hierarchy of values, right back to what we can call the good. And Peterson just says, that's what I call God. God is this. But now, I don't agree with that, but that's actually a sophisticated way of thinking about God. that's very similar to Paul Tillich, but it's much better said than Paul Tillich. And it's I think there's real fuzziness in Peterson's thinking, but if you tear it back, you go, yes, Peterson doesn't want to get into that, does God exist or not? But Peterson's almost going, God is the name for the fundamental value that undergirds everything. And it's very similar to God as the ground of being. So, and he fluffed it because if he'd said that well, God, that could have really advanced the popular YouTube arguments about
Could have.
religion. Sadly, he
Yeah.
he fluffed it completely,
Yeah.
which I'm not surprised by in a way. I think he's, as you said, I think he's under a lot of stress. Anyway,
That's right. That's right.
but yeah. But what I'll do now is come to your central question. I'll say some thoughts and see if this is what you're touching on, and please come back to me if I'm missing it. But in terms of the notion, the classical notion of God and capitalism and how they function together, broadly speaking, and this is what Todd McGowan argues in his, I think his first book, which is brilliant, called The End of Dissatisfaction, is that you have let's say three notions of the three notions of God here. One is God is complete. Uh, yes, God is complete. God is whole. God lacks the lack, right? God is the ultimate thing. Um, but we are lacking, we are castrated, we are divided, right? So we go to feudalism. Let's think about feudalism. You are in a feudal village. You cannot dream about getting the Maserati. It's not that you don't have death drive. It's not that death drive didn't exist in feudalism, but it had nowhere to fucking go, right? Because you couldn't make enough to start just desiring the increase of capital, right? If capitalism, from a Marxist perspective, is can if the motor of capitalism is the enjoyment of the increase of capital, i.e., if you think of Bitcoin, when people start just enjoying having Bitcoin and not what it can buy, right? You suddenly now get enjoyment out of the number going up rather than taking it out and actually purchasing stuff, right? It's not about the commodity, it's about the increase of money, right? That wasn't possible in feudalism. You grew up and you died in the same village. You could never hope to aspire to very much more than, I'm sure small aspirations, but nothing big. The only person who was undivided was God or the lord and the lady who lived in the manor, right? But everyone else divided. This created social solidarity because you were all in the shit together. We're all, we're all in the same boat, right? So that's the first God. God is undivided and complete, but we're all castrated. The God of capitalism is God is whole and complete, and so can we through the commodity. We can, and Adam Smith gets this. I mean, Adam Smith basically says capitalism works because we are stupid enough to think that having more and more and more will make us happy, right? Adam Smith thought that was ridiculous as well. He basically said having too little money is really bad and having too much money is really bad. There is a nice little middle place, but none of us believe it. We all want more and more and more and more and more, and that's what drives, that just drives the system. So in this system, and this is what Lacan means by the superegoic injunction to enjoy. When you're on Facebook and you're on Instagram or whatever, there is a constant superegoic injunction for more, to enjoy, to seize the day, to maximize. You're surrounded by uncastrated people who seem to have what you don't. That generates fragmented society, jealousies and envies, right? Which we see, in, as well as fatigue and burnout, ADHD, all modern symptoms. Um, and then also, really importantly, which we can come back to, but this is very key, is I think that generates a regression. Because when you are told that you can have it all, just do it, just enjoy, be an entrepreneur of the self hack, life hack, be your own boss and all of that, it becomes so exhausting and so anxiety producing, contra Wilhelm Reich, that there will be a return to authoritarian groups. So you see, the primal fathers are all becoming religious. The trad revival. You've got Andrew Tate, you've got Russell Brand, you've got lots of people in the left and the right returning to religion. You could see that partly, like in LA, I saw it. When you're able to do anything you want, it doesn't generate fun. It generates loneliness and fear and isolation. And so you end up going to Hillsong, the local evangelical church, because that's a better place to date. Because with the restrictions, you can actually date and stuff. So generally, but the third position, which Todd McGowan argues in that book, is that God is divided and so are you. So for me, I think the relationship between capitalism and the contemporary God of the demand to enjoy, and again, that's not a theistic God, it's the super egoic demand to enjoy, enjoy, enjoy. The fear of missing out is what the kids call it. I think, I'm sure not anymore. They'll have a better term for it. But if, a FOMO is basically the super, like as Zizek says, the super egoic injunction is not saying you should be nicer to your mum. It's saying you're not having enough sex, you don't have enough friends, you're not going out enough, right? You're not going to enough parties. That's the super egoic injunction. That's why Zizek says it's not just about freedom to be happy, it's also freedom from happiness. Freedom from happiness is freedom from the super egoic injunction to enjoy. And I think that in the same way that capitalism generates a commodity that is undivided, that if you get the commodity, if you succeed in society, you can sacrifice, and you can enjoy and have jouissance to your heart's content, like a Pascalian jouissance of getting to heaven. Then the religious version of that is the heavenly jouissance, God who is whole and complete, that we can have and we can have. It's religion of nihilism. I think that's the connection with that classical notion of God. Is that connected with what you were meaning, or because I think it's very important to connect the economic mechanism with, as you say, like what ideologies are produced.
I think so. I think so. I think the part that I think that the one part it doesn't quite get at though that I'm wondering about, and maybe I can use you keep bringing up Todd's work, and so maybe I can use him as a sort of connecting point here. So in his book on universality and identity politics, right, he's talking about the real conception of the left, like the real left from his position is a place of non-belonging, right? It's for people. And so I think that there's an interesting way, though, that there's two things that happen here. On the one side, we're saying left, which necessarily excludes right.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so we're using a term of belonging that is predicated on excluding a side that supposedly cares about belonging more. And then
Yeah.
says, well, the good people, we get together on the basis of non-belonging. You see where this is
Yes.
going. But it
100%.
scapegoats people who care about belonging. And who's going to care about belonging? Well, probably people like most people, first of all. Probably most people, first of all. Second of all, probably working people, mostly. And it seems like we can intellectually develop more sophisticated kinds of belonging, even kinds of belonging that call themselves non-belonging, through a university discourse, especially if we have been to the university, especially if we are into theory. But then, of course, the reproduction of our relations of production are based in this divide between those people who do go to university and those people who don't. People who get into theory are more intellectual versus people who don't. Of course, most people who go to university today aren't into theory. But as far as this old idea of like the church, where there's people who study and they know, and then there's people who are the laity, and they're just supposed to kind of be humble and trust and obey. That still seems to be something that's reified here, but also I don't see how either that conception of non-belonging, or we'll even go, I'm just going to hystericize, this more radical conception of God. I'm not so sure that this is something that can even work for people who aren't either, first of all, really into theory, second of all, really put out by evangelicalism, or third, aren't in some way already super progressive, which is to say, disposed towards being progressive, which is to say, their subjectivity has been formed in a field, and its habitus is a structural relation to all these other habituses, which means this position of non-belonging or of radicality requires these other people being true believers. And so, like, to me, it feels like a real problem, and a problem if we're thinking of a 500-year project. And I like to also think long term. I feel like this is one of the biggest problems of our times, because it a lot of times it's like, if everyone would just be a little bit more like us, then things could work out. And I want large scale structural change, preferably in my lifetime, but also, you know, what by the time my grandkids are in their 30s, you know, maybe they could be a part of something really important that's happening. And it's like when I try to think, well, what could actually, in terms of large scale structural change, achieve the end of reliance on slavery in the Congo for the supply of cobalt or neighboring countries' lithium or what have you, much less, you know, at least a third, if not over two-thirds of the planet spending the majority of its life working to create surplus value for someone else somewhere else. That's the goal, is to free up time, energy, so that people are able to discover their talents and work with one another to create and have fun, and that's a very progressive leftist sounding goal from my standpoint. I think it always sounds progressive and leftist when I say it, but for me it's like, well, I don't think it's possible when we aren't realists about the kinds of people who will be true believers, and when we can't work with them somehow, and I don't know how to work with them, and
Yeah.
and that's the struggle, that's the tension, that's kind of what we're trying to grok out here as we go into these kinds of spaces and experience these kinds of contrasts, because we have our immediate egoic reactions of why are they like this, but then we also are like, but they're not going to go away. Like the last 100 years hasn't changed anything. All of these ways of setting ourselves apart as progressives or leftists, or it hasn't achieved anything but siloing these communities more, so that we have like these super niche reactionary types of universalists opposed to these super niche reactionary sorts of Baptists. And I just feel like, what's our role in all of that, and how can theory help us with that, is kind of what we're trying to think through.
Yeah. I mean, as well, like I'm thinking in terms of where are the places where real solidarity around difference happen. I think like in Northern Ireland, and this is less so annoying because pubs are becoming quite ideological sometimes. But traditionally, a working class bar in Belfast is where radical social solidarity around lack happens. Where Protestants, for example, and Catholics can drink in a bar. You say it's even a loyalist bar, and Catholic goes in for context during the Troubles, Catholics and Protestants, you know, fighting all of that. But in a good bar, there was a place where you would go in, there would be sectarian jokes would be told. If you were a Protestant or a Catholic, you would be, yeah, they would tell jokes about you. And that was not when you knew you weren't accepted. That's when you knew that you were accepted. Alfie Bowen's written very well on this. Is like, you know, the place of inappropriate jokes, which is very key in Northern Ireland. The very thing you don't get in universities where language is so policed. You want the most incorrect place to go as a pub in a working class Belfast, you know, working class bar, but it's a place where there is social solidarity. Nothing to do with the university, nothing to do with theory, nothing to do, like there is social solidarity around difference. So for me, I've never worked a day in the university, not a big fan. And the thing, but coming back to capitalism is for the whole interesting thing that I think the left today, because I don't like to use that term. I love the way you use both left and right. I think that's very clever. And I like the way you've got two things going with those two different terms. I think subverting this left right thing is what we have to do. And I think you're doing it very well. The what's oh yeah. So within Marxist theory is you have like the problem with capitalism from say a Marxist perspective, I think is that capitalism, it actually reveals the truth, right? The point of capitalism is it lets loose death drive, right? So there's no going back. So for someone like Todd McGowan, he would say that the problem is this. So capitalism, every commodity gives you what you want. It's not a case of saying commodities don't give you what they want. They do. What you want is dissatisfaction. We don't know that, right? But every commodity gives you dissatisfaction. And that's what drives us. If commodities actually worked, capitalism would is one of the ways capitalism would collapse. Because if you got rich, I know loads of people who got rich and famous, and a lot of them were miserable if they didn't have other things that they could give themselves to, because when they got the dream, they collapsed, they psychically collapsed. So we have a system where the losers lose doubly, but even the winners lose. So it's ridiculous. So within capitalism, the commodity gives you what you want, which is dissatisfaction. Just like the gambler is not addicted to winning, they're actually addicted to losing, right? If you're not a gambler, you want to win, but if you're addicted to gambling, your addiction is hooked in precisely to the loss. This is what. Oh, by the way, sorry, Pascal understood this so well. Just to digress for a second and to divert us. Pascal said, we're miserable. So what we do is we want to get the right distance from an object. We don't want the thing and we don't want to be so far from it. So hunting was his example. So for Pascal, basically, he goes, imagine a hunt. So I'm about to go on a hunt. And then I go, somebody comes to me with the fox dead and says, oh, you don't need to go on the hunt. There's the fox. I'd be really disappointed, right? And so then the person, let's think they're really autistic and very literal, and they're going, "Oh, sorry, sorry. Well, here you can go out and do the hunt. I mean, the fox isn't there, but work away in the hunt." I'd also be disappointed, right? So the point of the hunt is not to have the fox, and it's also not to not have the fox. It's to have the right amount of disappointment, the right amount of distance, and that's what sports do. That's why sports are $1 trillion business, because sports really work not on your team winning, but on the closeness of your team winning and losing. In fact, sports have all of these mechanisms that if a team is really shit, then they find ways to increase it. I think in American football or something, if you're last, you're the first to choose. I don't know how it works. Or in horse racing, there's more weights on things. Or they always find ways because they know. I've seen it with people who watch sports. I was with a friend a few months ago. She was watching rugby. As soon as her team was winning by a long shot, she lost interest completely. And then the other team started to come back, and then she started taking interest. So that's divertisement. Pascal wasn't saying that we want objects, we want a certain form of an amount of disappointment, right? So capitalism gives us that. But where is the problem? It also obfuscates it. We don't realize that. We don't know that what we like is struggle itself, is sacrifice. Without sacrifice, there is no meaning. Sacrifice is central. Religion is based on sacrifice. The first act of religions is sacrifice. That's why you buy a round of drinks. That's why you bring a bottle of wine to a party. There has to be gift. There has to be something that's non-exchange, right? Anyway, so capitalism gives us dissatisfaction, but it obfuscates it, and that dissatisfaction is so horrific to some people, and some people get so much benefit from it at the expense of other people. So basically, what capitalism does is it generates its own end. I think from a Marxist perspective, is surplus value is it generates its own contradictions and its own eventual collapse. Maybe it won't, and maybe we'll all die, right? But technically, the answer is in the toxicity. And in the same way, this next move of Christianity, I think it's the next Reformation. It should be. Hegel is the next Aquinas. Technically, should be. If this in this next Reformation. It is the idea that we embrace alienation and sacrifice. We enjoy it. And by doing that, we break capitalism. In the same way that in analysis, by accepting your symptom, you dissipate it. By enjoying your symptom, the negativity of the symptom dissipates. Ironically, in capitalism, by enjoying the dissatisfaction, you break the mechanism of capitalism. Now, I am a believer that we can create communions that within capitalism that break this mechanism, where we have a different mode of desire. And I'm trying to create those communions. Who knows if that, but that's it. We create those communions where we're broke from that form of libidinal desire. And I'll just give one example, and then but a friend of mine wanted to buy a boat recently, just a little tiny boat, sailboat. And she went to this old guy to buy a sailboat she saw on like eBay or whatever, I know, the paper. And this old guy was a very, very curmudgeonly, old, grumpy man. And all he did was tell her how bad it is to own a boat. And he told her, he says, there's two happiest days of a boat owner's life is the day they buy it and the day they sell it. And they both were talking. So he was a seller of the boat who didn't want to sell it. And she was a buyer of the boat who realized that she didn't really want to buy a boat. She just liked looking at them and thinking about it. So you have this really interesting couple of a buyer who doesn't want to buy and a seller who doesn't want to sell, enjoying the process itself.
Mhm.
That for me is where capitalism at the libidinal level where we become unplugged. And that's the work of the liturgy of the Church of the Contradiction to unplug us from that mode of desire.
Mhm. That was going to be one of my questions is, yeah, what is the purpose, I suppose, or what do you hope to get out of what do you hope that people would get out of a church of consciousness? And so maybe you can speak more about that because I think like you can go to some churches and you can kind of get a sense of like what they're trying to do. They're trying to teach you how to be a good person. They're trying to teach you how to get to heaven. Um, and I don't think you would want to send people off with a certain way to think. I think like we've,
Yes.
established that. But yeah, so maybe you could expand on this a little bit more. Like what would be that goal, that ideal for you to see come out of a church of consciousness?
Or
Yeah, or
contradiction.
contradiction, church
Or
contradiction. Yeah,
sorry,
yeah.
contradiction, contradiction.
Yeah.
That's what I meant.
But I like that Freudian slip as conscious because it is about consciousness erasing. It's becoming conscious of our alienation. So I think that slip is actually tells the truth. It's
Right.
because it's about raising consciousness, raising to consciousness this unconscious love of sacrifice of desire. So almost like if you talk to anybody who's successful, what do they love talking about most? Well, it's the time when they were in that shitty student accommodation with their friends, working hard on the project and doing it, because that's where all the fun is. That's the hardest stuff, but that's where all the meat is. The trick is how do we kind of enjoy that? And it's so productive. It's like almost like saying, and anybody who, if you write a book, for example, it's going like, it's the process of writing it is the fun. If you think that it's the publication and the parties, well, as you know, you're going to be sorely disappointed. Dave, you just published a book, and everyone knows how anticlimactic it is, right? But can you enjoy just the writing? Can you enjoy because it's sacrifice? It's real sacrifice. You're sitting down and you're writing. You're not going out when you want to go out. You're sitting working through things whenever you could be doing other. It's real sacrifice, but can you enjoy the sacrifice itself? Um, and so I know it's successful if I create things where, and I can talk about the mechanisms some other time maybe, but
Mhm.
through the mechanism, the technology of the liturgy, people feel libidinally disinvested from the frenetic pursuit of certainty and satisfaction, where they can enjoy their dissatisfaction. So one example from Žižek, which I think is brilliant. Žižek fantastically uses the example of a traditional parent who says to their kid, Johnny, you have to go and see Granny. And the kid says, I don't want to see Granny. And the parents go, get your coat, get in the car, you're going to see Granny. And then he compares it with and contrasts it with a progressive family who says, Johnny, you have to go and see your granny. And little Johnny says, I don't want to see Granny. And the progressive parents sit Johnny down and they say, but you really do want to see Johnny, right? Or Granny, she loves you and you want to make her happy and you're a good boy, right? So they gaslight him basically, right? So so Zizek says, this is even worse, right? Not only does he have to go, he has to want it, right? Now, then
Mhm.
the reason Zizek uses this, he says, right, and of course it's also not true because if little Johnny doesn't get gaslit and says no I really do want to go, then they'll go back to A and go get your coat on, get in the car, you're going to see Granny, right? So traditionally working class people still to this day, they go to work but they don't like it, right? You go to work and you stop at 5, you try and work as slowly as possible that you'll get away with, and and you don't think about it over the weekend. For middle classes, they don't just have to work, they have to like it. You have to go to the corporate
Mhm.
retreat, wear the t-shirts, get libidinally invested. These systems like Microsoft and Facebook, it's like and there's a Mitchell and Webb, some of my favorite comedians from the UK. One of them was talking about this, going like, I hate customer service in America because everybody has to pretend to be happy. He says, if you're doing a shit job, and you're smiling, he says, that's a sign of a moron or a liar, right? Because it's shit. But that's the thing in America, you don't just work for Gap. You have to enjoy it. You have to like it. You get your pep talk like fucking Braveheart at the start. And you go, yeah, we're gonna do it. And thing is, if and so you're libidinally invested in your own oppression. As Neil Postman says, you're amusing yourself to death.
Right.
Not only are we oppressed, we don't know we're oppressed. We're separated from our own oppression. And that's why I think modern symptoms like fatigue come in, because we don't even know how alienated we are because we're so libidinally invested. So what
Mhm.
Church of the Contradiction attempts to do is libidinally disinvest you from enjoying your work with Deliveroo. Now, here's the thing it doesn't give you. It doesn't give you another job. It doesn't stop you from having to do Deliveroo to pay your rent. Doesn't that no promises there, right? But here's the thing: if you're libidinally disinvested from the work that you're doing, you're at least more likely to potentially find a way to break free. It's one step
Mhm.
towards, and it's similar to when Marx says, when he talks about religion in the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right. He says, religion is the imaginary flowers and the chains of our oppression. We must get rid of the imaginary flowers, not so that we see the chains and despair, but so that we can break the chains and pick living flowers. So the idea is libidinally disinvest so that you can see the chains of your work. Now, as I say, I am not promising because I know everyone has to pay their rent. It's a nightmare out there for most people. It's horrible. But but at least I want to libidinally disconnect people from the system so that they at least might be able to start looking for alternative ways. And I think Dave is a perfect example of this. He was not so invested in the economic system, therefore was able to start looking for ways out. And you guys have found, well, not everyone, hardly anybody will find a way out, right? Let's be honest. But the first step is libidinally disinvest from the system, which involves for me
Mhm.
realizing its fantasy structure, how to traverse the fantasy of capitalism and see the chains, and then at least we might be able to, a few of us, break them and pick living
Mhm.
flowers. Sorry, I'm waffling, I'm
Yeah.
preaching, but I
No,
that's what I
no, this
do.
is
That's what we
this is
wanted, man.
awesome.
Yeah.
Thought to write and think
Yeah.
about. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm
Um,
not a speaker, I'm a preacher, it's like these are I'm passionate about. Yeah. Yeah.
I
love to
just
see it
I
though.
just quick I mean I know Anne's got to get to work here, but I just
Right.
if we just a quick little, and this is just a you talked about the master university analyst in hysteric discourses, and you're going for a church of the hysteric, and you talked about the conservatives and the progressives being like the I wrote master orders, university advises, analyst blank slates, hysteric. What's the one word for the hysteric if I'm being overly simplistic here?
Divided God or divided subject. Yeah. What were the
Okay,
so yeah the
divided.
yeah.
Okay, yeah, exactly. Okay, now, but what church? What's the Church of the Blank Slate? Is there such a thing?
Yeah, so yeah, that's a great question. So for me, Jesus is like the analyst discourse or Socrates. So let's use the example of Socrates. These are figures who, the thing about Socrates and Jesus as presented, say, in the Gospels, is they're not giving a philosophy. They're not going to a systematic set of beliefs. What they do, and Socrates says, I know nothing, right? What they do is they are a blank slate for the other to begin to question and to begin to see their own desires. So, like, parabolistic speech is a great example. Parables don't tell you what to think. You can interpret them in so many different ways that they kind of break you open, and in a good parable you encounter your own unconscious desire, and you encounter maybe a part of yourself that you wish you hadn't encountered. And you look at Socrates and the figure of Jesus, and they're very good at that. So in the analyst discourse, the agent is A, right? And underneath A, it's very important, is knowledge, S2. What does that mean? Well, both Socrates and Jesus are figures in which people assumed that they had some knowledge, some secret knowledge, knowledge of themselves. So you look at Socrates and he says, I know nothing, but he somehow brings you somewhere because in his questioning, you and in your belief that they know something, you come to know. So an example I use is my friend Elliot, who I did a podcast with. One time I told him a dream, and I didn't have any idea what it meant. But I said, I had this weird dream. Then he went off somewhere, came back with a big smile on his face, and I said to him, oh, I know what you think that dream means. And I told him. And he said, I was smiling about something else. Why do you think I was thinking about your dream? Right. But I needed him as the subject supposed to know. I projected onto him a secret knowledge that he knew what the dream meant. And then I was able to come to the right interpretation of the dream, right? Because it suddenly became clear to me. So what I would argue is so Jesus is like the analyst discourse, and Christ crucified, my God, why have you forsaken me? The divided God is the hysterics discourse. And yeah, what I didn't talk about is I think that the role of Seacon is hysterics discourse, but its role as a evangelical role is as the analyst discourse. So when people leave the Church of the Contradiction liturgy, what I hope they will be is they'll be kind of like a mirror that will allow people to encounter their own unconscious desires. So I don't think there's a church of the analyst discourse, but I think the analyst discourse is very, very also key to my project,
Mm,
in a way that I still need to work out the details.
mm.
There might be a possibility of the analyst discourse as a church. I have thought about it. Um, the Yeah, but as I say, I almost think it's like to be like Jesus, and what I mean by to be like Jesus is not to be a nice person or anything like that, but rather to be someone who speaks enigmatically and allows
Yeah.
enough space for the other person to come to know their own unconscious desires. Because there's a beautiful verse in the Bible that says, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free." Now, it's obviously not about mathematical truth or whatever. So in psychoanalysis, the truth of your unconscious, just knowing it, just having that come into the symbolic world, into the symbolic, is enough to free you. So that's why in psychoanalysis you speak, you speak, you speak, you speak, and in that speaking you find emancipation. You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. That's the evangelical work of the radical Christian.
I just I'm kind of smiling here because I'm thinking about how, you said that Jesus and Socrates both will hystericize people and also play this role of blank slate. And I was thinking about how, yeah, not only did Jesus speak enigmatically a lot of the time, of course, the Sermon on the Mount or what have you, this is pretty straightforward. But when he's speaking in parables, it's like, yeah, it's enigmatic. It's on you to interpret. You actually have you are responsible for interpretation. And one of the things I've been thinking a lot about is that there are a lot of churches, they're not just conservative, but also especially where they want to act like you're not responsible for interpretation. Here's what the truth is. We know what it is. This is what it is. That's not an interpretation. They're telling you what it is, and then they'll cherry pick to support their interpretation. But there's oh, this is not an interpretation. This is what it is. This is the truth. And so, of course, it's like anti-theology and anti-hermeneutics in a sort of sense, because they're trying to say to you, oh, all that other stuff that everyone else is going to talk about, you don't even bother with that. Here, we'll just tell you what it is. And then it's interesting because Jesus did say, go out into the world and tell everybody. He didn't say go out and tell everybody what my parables meant. Like, that's not
Yeah,
something he
no,
ever said. He also never explained his parables. He didn't like say,
yeah, and said
so
different things to different people.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah. No,
yeah.
and said different weird things to people, like really weird things to people. A good parable is like the Mona Lisa, like a great piece of art. And this is very much what Freud said about dreams, is a dream needs to be overdetermined. It's got multiple meanings that often contradict and overlap. And then every dream has what he calls the navel of the dream, which is the enigmatic ontological mystery that cannot be penetrated. And so in the Mona Lisa, it's just the easiest example, most famous painting. There's loads of interpretations about it and, ways of, X-raying it and seeing all this and who was she and what was she thinking. But what makes the Mona Lisa famous is the enigmatic smile. So it's the whole thing of, is it a smile? What is she smiling about? And actually, more importantly, to put a Girardian or Lacanian spin on it, is what's most important about the Mona Lisa is not the enigmatic smile. What is she thinking? It's why is everybody else like it? So when I went to see it, for example, like what makes the Mona Lisa so interesting is why the hell is it interesting to everybody else, right? So most of us, like art critics, might be interested in the enigmatic smile, but someone like me is just there because of the desire of other people. But they're all there because of the desire of other people. But there's an enigmatic. So in the same way, a parable can be interpreted multiple times and has at its core an impenetrability. that is which stops it from being totalized.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much, man.
Yeah.
This has
Thank you.
been
I've loved
awesome.
this. Love seeing you guys, and
Yeah, hopefully. I know
yeah,
we could probably all keep talking for 2 more hours if we were able to, but that just means we'll have a great follow-up in the future.
brilliant,
Yeah.
Right.
wonderful. Okay, well, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank
Yeah,
you.
look forward to chatting again.
All
Yeah,
right.
good luck finishing your book when the inspiration calls to you. Look forward to reading it one day, and yeah, thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you.
Subscribers get access to all past courses at Theory Underground, as well as ongoing courses taught by David McKerracher, Benjamin Studebaker, and Nina Power. Subscribers also get access to monthly research seminars, and the higher tiers of involvement unlock discussions and one-on-one small group tutelage. So if you're like me and you're never a huge bookish kind of person, but somewhere along the way you got really into listening to educational materials, if you got really into listening to podcasts and then books at work, if you love going deep into ideas, but you're just not a traditional bookish kind of person, well, this is where the alliance between people like us and people who are more bookish and specialized are able to meet to work through these things and do so in defense of the human, in defense of our dignity, in defense of our common humanity and our intellectual integrity. This is not a place where we're going to kick you out because you're pro-life or pro-choice, or where you are an atheist or a agnostic or a Christian. But it is a place where you're expected to love one another regardless of such things, and to show up for people in your actual IRL real life communities regardless of such things. And if that is exciting for you, and if you're excited to learn about what this approach, this method, this school of thought has to offer, then I'm excited to meet you. Subscribe today.